Hello, everyone, and welcome to Poets in Conversation for April 2023. Hard to believe, even when I say it. National Poetry Month. We're kicking it off right this month with a stellar lineup of poets for discussion, Ms. Patricia Smith and Ms. Eugenia Leigh. Welcome to both of you, and congratulations on your beautiful new books.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Having us.
I first of all just want to flash the books because they're so beautiful. I try never to ask about covers just because I feel like it's a question that's usually covered elsewhere, no pun intended, but they're so beautiful. Both of them, I found myself being distracted often when I was reading. So welcome again to both of you, and welcome to everyone who's watching. I think that we could go on and fill the whole program if I were to list the accolades of both of our guests, but I want to give just a quick introduction to both of them before we get started talking about these new books. Patricia Smith is the recipient of innumerable awards, including the Poetry Foundation's Ruth Lilly Award for Lifetime Achievement, and she is the author of 8 much-beloved poetry collections, for which Ms. Smith has earned the Kingsley Tufts Poetry Award, the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, the NAACP Image Award for Outstanding Literary Work, and finalist honors for the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award. So these are not small accolades. These are pretty comprehensive. Patricia's new collection is Unshuttered, which book list praises with a starred review, if you can see it there, starred review, and says, with tender precision, Smith's exquisite photo album elucidates our past and steers us toward a more conscious and ethical future. So welcome to Ms. Patricia Smith.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that.
Excited to introduce as well Eugenia Leigh, whose poems and essays have appeared in The Atlantic, The Nation, Guernica Poetry, Plowshares, and elsewhere. Her first collection, Blood, Sparrows, and Sparrows, was a finalist for both the National Poetry Series and the Yale Series of Younger Poets. Eugenia serves as poetry editor at Adroit and the Valentine's editor at Honey Literary, a BIPOC-focused literary journal and literary arts organization. Of Eugenia's new collection, Bianca, Kathy Parkong says, the book devastates her. And Tracy Brimhall calls Bianca, quote, a book she didn't know she was waiting for. Pretty high praise, I think, personal praise. So welcome to you also, Eugenia, and congratulations on the book.
Thank you so much.
I thought we could begin with kind of a question that circles around something that we always think about probably as poets, which is the relationship, of course, between I guess what is usually termed the personal and the political, but I also wanted to think about it as the intimate and the public. Patricia, with your book, Unshuttered seems to engage very directly a kind of public-facing historical idea. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how engaging these lives and these individuals who make up history told and untold affected you personally, or made you feel connected to a personal lyric impulse. And then I'm going to flip the question for you, Eugenia, in a second.
Yeah, for me, there was really a direct link. When I started collecting the photos, and I was collecting all 19th century photos that I could find, daguerreotypes, ambrotypes, tintypes, cabinet cards, it was just a curiosity. My husband and I spent a lot of time on our weekends going to flea markets and estate sales, and I would find these things. And, the poet loves nothing more than a good face, right? I mean, immediately we start conjuring these stories. So I was collecting them kind of as curiosity. And then a little bit later, I started to specialize in collecting the images of African Americans, simply because I wasn't finding them as much, realizing that you were either well-to-do enough to have a portrait made, or you were part of the cataloging of someone else's property. You were their cook, or you were the carriage driver, or you were, and I was trying to figure out, why am I so attached? I would start conjuring these histories, and I'd give them names. Sometimes there would be names on the back, and I finally realized that my mother, when she came up from the South, from Alabama to Chicago, she was very ashamed of being from the South. She wanted to be a city girl, and so when I would ask her about her history and therefore my history, she would say, oh, well, what do you want to know about that down South stuff for? And meanwhile, I'm meeting people. My husband can trace his family back to the 1600s, and mine just kind of stops in this suitcase of curled cornered Polaroids that my mother had, people who she could not really identify after a certain time. So I didn't feel that there was any real viable history that I could walk back into, you know. And I think surrounding myself with these photos and really not knowing that could be my great great grandfather or that could, I sort of forged my own family, or at least that sense of family, and so I think, and when I realized that, I said, that's why, these photos have taken such an important part. Oh, and then one other thing really quickly, when my father died, all of my pictures and stuff, my father had them. And we went to my mother to say, okay, we're going to do my family tree or something. We're going to get to see if we can find pictures from her. And my mother did not have, she had one picture of me, and it was my high school graduation picture. And all my childhood pictures, all my class pictures, all those things left with my father. And when my father died, my mother allowed the city to clean out his apartment and all my photos. So I don't have baby photos, I don't have anything. So I think that's one of the reasons I didn't want to feel like every time I turned around there was nothing there, and I think these photos, while it's a huge hollow that can't be completely filled, they went away toward me looking back and seeing someone, seeing something. So that was my real personal link to them. So while it looks like I'm celebrating this public thing and saying, okay, let's all explore our histories, it's also giving me a root that I didn't have before.
I would just suggest to anyone who has not heard Patricia's Blaney lecture from, I think, just last week through the Academy of American Poets. We'll link to that, where you talk so beautifully about that suitcase and about those photographs. So anyone who wants to hear more can go hear that. So Eugenia, how about you? Patricia describes reaching outward across distances of time and geography in order to make a connection. In your book, I felt there was much more of a bubbling forth from within. And so I'm just wondering how this, if it does feel that way to you, this internal reflection or this introspection makes you feel connected potentially to something outside of yourself.
I think that's what I'm wondering now. In some ways, writing the book was sort of that inward look, and publishing it and sharing it with people, I'm recognizing now that in articulating our own stories, sometimes we are articulating the stories of entire communities or other people as well. And I've had so many people reach out to talk about their mental illnesses, for example, or I get a lot of people sharing their medications with me. I think, we sometimes just want to be seen. We want to recognize, the things that we do to try to survive our everyday, and we want validation for that. And we want to know that somebody else gets it, that, it sucks to take medication every day, and to share the names of our medications and what we've tried. And in a way, I think I'm recognizing that in telling our own stories, we're inevitably telling the story of an entire community. And I've said this before, but I feel like one of the barriers that I had was, why should I be the one to talk about my mental illness? What's so special about that? We already have books about bipolar 2 disorder or, complex PTSD. But I think I've recognized that with all of the intersections that each person's story has, whether it's race or sexuality or whatever else, I feel like we don't need just some mental illness stories. We need all the mental illness stories. And I think that's sort of a realization that I've had as I've begun to share is I hope that my story isn't special, that I want it to just encourage everybody else to tell their stories as well. And for us to contribute to this communal archive almost of our narratives and our experiences.
Thank you so much for that. I wanted to ask especially about both projects. Well, both of you have written outside of the genre of poetry. Eugenia, in Bianca, there are sort of hybrid sections that appear to be prose. And I know there's a form that I had been unfamiliar with called a Zuhitsu, which I thought was really interesting. And Patricia, of course, you have a long history of experimenting with form. I thought we could talk a little bit about how experimenting with and pouring the poems and the stories into different containers formally, both in terms of the line and line breaks. We have couplets, we have rhyme experiments, sonnets, so on and so forth. I thought we could talk a little bit about how pouring this material through different forms maybe elevated it for you or taught you something you didn't know about the project. Patricia, can I turn to you for this first, since you're such an expert?
Sure. I want to link this back to something Eugenia just said about not feeling like you're the only one. Uh, there are often people say, is there anything that you wouldn't write? And of course, there's always something, but if I'm not writing it, I'm at least reaching for it, because there's no feeling like the one when someone says, I felt that, I just didn't know there was a way to say it. Um, and so I'm constantly trying to figure out new ways to approach that difficult thing. It doesn't have to be something you're writing for publication. Sometimes it's just the idea of writing to get on the other side of it. And so one of the things that I'm really a champion of is really kind of immersing yourself not only in traditional like sonnets, villanelles, things like that, but your own little nonce form, your own little trick in your head, your own little every fifth line I will have no ease. You know, I mean something mathematical, some form that you don't associate with the thing, you know. So, you know, for instance, I often, you know, I'll tell my students, well, tell me the thing that you think you're reaching for that you have been able to access. And everyone has something. And I say, okay, let's see if we can put that in a different kind of container. So at one point I told my students, here's a sheet that tells you how to write a limerick. Everybody knows what a limerick is. So just say the thing again, but say it in a limerick. I'm not asking you to really delve into it. Just restate what the thing is. Do it in a limerick. And of course, they're so resistant at first. You can't do that. Why? Because a limerick is supposed to be funny. Why? Who told you that? Why? You know, it's always been funny. So here's where we change. You know, so there was a woman who had been psychologically abused by her mother, uh, abused almost to the point of physical abuse, but not quite. And her father was kind of the briefcase in the background, going to work, coming home from work, going to work, coming home from work. And she wanted to write about the one day she thought her mother was actually going to physically harm her. She was in the kitchen and she was holding a knife and she was yelling at her and she's waving the knife. And I said, okay, you know, let's do that. And so she resisted. And then I kind of caught her counting the syllables under the table, you know. And then finally what she wrote was, uh, oh, uh, something in the kit. Wait, there in the kitchen she stood. She'd kill me this time, swore she would. Waving the knife, my mother, his wife, I screamed, and my father said, good.
Hmm.
So it was, and it wound up that she was focusing all of this on her mother, but realizing there was a real resentment on her, that she had for her father for not interfering, not talking, not even thinking it, acting like it was any of his concern, you know. And so I said, now you're at that door. You can either touch it, feel the heat again, and back up 20 more spaces and throw that piece of paper away, or you can write a next line, or you can do a stream of consciousness thing, you know. And if you throw it away later, fine, but you've spent time on that other side of the door and you've proven to yourself that you can do that, you know. So whether or not they dwell there after opening the door is up to them, but you just have to get them in the space and see that the space will not kill them, that they have control over it.
Wow. That's amazing.
And how about for you, Eugenia? Are these formal considerations? There was so much formal work in your poems. I'm wondering how they're playing with your own process.
When I was thinking about the Zuhitsu that you mentioned, I was trying to figure out ways to not just talk about bipolar 2 disorder or talk about the way PTSD shows up in parenthood or, later in life, but to try to recreate the experience of that, to kind of put on display what it's like to have mental illness and to have to walk through it. And while I was writing this book, I was reading Toy Derricott's The Undertaker's Daughter, and I was reading Tina Ching's Hybrida and Kimiko Han's Narrow Road to the Interior. And Kimiko Han and Tina Ching both use the Zuhitsu in a way that I think, and the Zuhitsu, for people who don't know, I guess, is a Japanese genre that is, that doesn't have a Western equivalent, but it's part essay, maybe part collage, part poem, and this sort of prosy, like messy, unwieldy, leapy piece of text. And I love the way that Kimiko Han and Tina Ching sort of use this genre in order to capture the uncapturable in a way, the messiness of being a mother and being a married person, the messiness of real life pain and trauma. And the Zuhitsu in this book came really late, and it's the only poem in which I'm able to articulate who Bianca is, like the manic alter ego that I was in my 20s. And I was like, this is the form that I've been waiting for, where I suddenly felt like the voice of Bianca could enter, because she was a messy person and she was this chaotic, unwieldy sort of monster. And to have the freedom of this form versus the short lines and the intense line breaks, I think allowed her to speak and allowed me to bring in these journal entries that were in her voice, or in my voice, I guess, from the past. And in some ways there were also, like there's a poem called Bipolar 2 Disorder, third evaluation, Ode to the Brain. And I think having access to the ode and being encouraged to write an ode. This was in a workshop with Tracy Brimhall, and she was like, find a body part to celebrate. And I wanted to find the body part that I hated the most, which was my brain. And I thought, okay, how do I celebrate the brain? And that was my first attempt at trying to celebrate bipolar 2 disorder, to try to do that. And I feel like that form gave me permission in a way to celebrate it that I felt like was contained. Whereas when I was just faced with a blank page, I didn't know how to access that kind of joy when talking about my mental illness.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
Okay. That's fascinating. I think one of the things, especially when you're teaching, my students very seldom realize the power they have as poets. They think of it all as being narrative power.
Mm.
But the joy in form is you can train the reader to read the poem the way you want them to. I mean, something as simple as, okay, you want me breathing deeply or heavily when I finish the poem because something is happening in the poem, which would cause that. So then you put the lines, the thicker lines, closer together with less punctuation. If you want me to muse at the beauty of what you've just done, maybe you write couplets and give me a chance to enter the poem and sit with it for a while every second line. But the amazing thing is, I said, if you have something, anything, a speaker, an institution, anything that's breaking down within the poem, it's amazing to see the text break down too, in some way, and become looser and more chaotic. And maybe the reader doesn't say, oh, I know exactly why she's doing that, but the reader will feel it. And so it's just that I love talking about all the power we have, the placement, the structure, the way the poem appears on the page, everything, the line breaks, the stanza breaks. It can conjure the mood you need the reader to be in to accept the poem. And finding that form that mirrored exactly what you wanted to do narratively, that's exactly what I'm talking about.
Well, that actually reminds me of a question I wanted to ask you, which is about your last poem, Unshuttered, which is, I guess, a cento of all of the poems in in the book Unshuttered, and it almost acts as like a chorus of all of the voices in every single one of these poems. And you take the first line and kind of either play with it or put it into that poem. And I was wondering, at what point in writing your book did that poem come about, and how did you know to decide, or how did you decide to do that? What was your intention around that?
I got introduced to poetry by getting up on stage and doing it. And I was in the slam community for a long time. And because of that, I'm always looking to make things more difficult for myself. That's kind of my, am I just going to write this, or am I going to do something? And that's my challenge every time. So initially, I had what amounted to three sonnet crowns, because I knew, so I had the 45 poems. And I found out in my initial, I was at Chivatella, I think, and I was trying to do these things. And when I read them, they were way too restrictive, in that I was still trying to have the last line of this poem be the first. And it wouldn't, you can't have personalities and say these are all very, very different people and then put them in that same restrictive box. So it wasn't working for a long time. And my trusted reader and friend, Kwame Dawes, that was one of the things when he first read the initial manuscript. He said, no, you can't do that. So I decided to just cut each poem open, not worry about the form, not worry about the last line, just the first line. Mm. So then when I realized I was going to do that, I wrote the last poem first. And then I moved the first lines. It's much easier. That's what I do. That's what I do when I write a crown. It's not, it will drive you nuts if you write the poems because you're constantly then going back and changing the lines. So you write that last one, and then all you have to worry about is, I'm going to start this poem with this line and end with this line. So it was my way of that last poem, the speakers in that, we are the speaker in that last poem, as we're looking at the photos and saying what they mean to us, what they didn't mean to us, how we've misinterpreted them, how we thought the pictures were saying one thing and they were saying something else. And as speakers, I wanted to bring something a little bit more contemporary to the book. So I thought, okay, when we're speaking, then I'll have that restrictive form, because we haven't learned what we need to learn from these photos. And we're still not asking enough of ourselves, even though we've been instructed to by them. So then I keep it in that form that hasn't broken loose yet.
The truth comes out.
Oh yeah.
No, I think it's so interesting. I mean, I think one of the most powerful books of the last few years to me is John Murillo's Contemporary American Poetry, which of course contains his much celebrated and even more deserved heroic sonnet crown, which does something similar, of course. And I've never thought to ask about the temporal interplay, when things were written and stuff. But can I ask a follow-up on this for both of you? And then maybe we can hear a poem that you feel like applies in the abstract or more directly. But I want to ask a formal follow-up, if you don't mind. And this relates, Eugenia, to your poem, which is so beautiful. And I mentioned to you before that I wish we had time for you to read the whole thing. People are going to have to get the book to read it. But your poem, Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder with Han, there's a line in which you say, the speaker says of the father, "See how I keep him flickering with a gerund." And it's almost as if in the course of writing the poem, the speaker / poet, perhaps, as Ruth Awad says, spoiler alert, it's me, but the voice of the poem has been led to a discovery about form. And so I was wondering from both of you, if there's a poem that comes to mind, or a moment in both books where you feel like the music took over or the form took over and led you to some discovery that maybe you hadn't thought of going in. I know that's a niche question, but Eugenia, you want to talk about that moment, if you don't mind, in the poem, if you remember that one. It's page 67 for anyone who might be following along.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was one of those moments where it's a long poem, and it was one of those moments where I didn't intend to write that. It comes to you in the writing where I'm talking about my father and his diagnosis with stage 4 lung cancer, and it's a moment of anger, and I say, watch me refuse to let my father die in this poem. He is dying, yes. And then it goes on, and I think it was that moment where I was just feeling snarky, right? Like I'm feeling angry, I'm feeling snarky, and then kind of becoming self-aware of the fact that I'm writing about him at all and writing about him dying. And at that point, I'd also become estranged from him again. And so I wasn't even sure if he was dead yet or if he was still just dying. And so I was aware of this idea of me writing him into this poem and writing the end of his life into this poem, but also not having the facts of his life or, the ending of it. I didn't know how to articulate that in any other way that besides that, in a way, that, well, here's a Jaren, so he is dying. I don't know if he's dead. And it was sort of my way of kind of admitting that without admitting that.
That's wow. So the question, there's nothing that happened like that in this book. However, listening, I realized that I have or had for a long time, like a really terrible relationship with my mother, just off, and I'm an only child. So that idea of having this one thing, is you don't say out loud anywhere, I don't get along with my mother, especially if you're with a room of women, especially if you're in a room with a room of black women. It's like you have to um, revere your mother at all costs. And then I had to ask myself, well, just because someone gives birth to you, does that mean that you're automatically of the same and that you have to automatically love? And so um, some poems that I've just started writing that approach as much as I can at this moment the truth in that. Um, it's a poem about sitting down with my mother where she all of a sudden, after she hadn't talked to me for 10 years, wanted to plan her funeral, wanted to make sure it was right and that the church people wouldn't talk about it, and I'm sitting there going, I don't even really know you. And I kept putting these cremation things at the top of the pile because I'm thinking, I can't do all that pomp and circumstance. I just don't, and so I could feel like that sort of burning knot in your, as I was writing the poem, because it was not me saying I'm gonna sit down and write a poem. It's like I'm gonna sit down and write about my mother, and things that I hadn't really brought to the surface were all kind of coming out. And at the end of it, it was just this flippant thing. When you said that, I was just feeling, and the last line of the poem is, go on, throw a match into her hair. Right. And I, I thought, do I change, and I said, no, I don't change it, because at the time I was so like listening to this stuff about who she wants to sit where at the funeral, da, 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 and not realizing you can't stop talking to somebody for 10 years and then show up like nothing happened. So yeah, it's led me not to a surprise and form so much, but in lines that I had held for so long that they surprised me and a little, and frighten me a little bit when they come to the surface and they come out.
Wow. Thank you both. I want to remind everyone who's watching to go ahead and put questions or comments that you might have for our poets in the comment box. Shortly, we'll be turning to the question and answer period from the audience. In the meantime, though, I think it might be a nice time for some poems, if you don't agree. Patricia, if you don't mind, is there a poem in particular that has come to mind during the course of this discussion that you'd be willing to share with us?
Sure. Uh, um, I the images in the book, and I'm going to do this and see if anybody can see. Oh, it's always the opposite way when you're. It drives me crazy. Okay, it's that image, right? Yeah, thank you. It's the first image in the book. It's a little tintype. It's only about this big, and I always thought from the moment I saw it, I saw a slight leaning forward, that really earnest look in his eyes, and I thought he's in love. He's in love, and his love is not being returned in the same way. Thank you, Allison. Oh, and this is also this is one of the poems in the book that's in form. So. You crush me with your damning glimpses, Anna. You, so rancorous, so wounding, and so cruelly bred to stain a man with scarring he won't see. Unsaid, my reckless want of you, this yearning, thirsting, blue inside these hands, is seed for malady, the mud that clogs my throat, a pantomime of moan and knees. Go home, you growl. I slip by agonized degrees into the sound. You mouth my name, unlatching flood. I beg you, Anna, search for mercy. Heave my hurt and humbled body close. Let pity drive your slight, unwilling hips into the waiting, sweated blight of mine. Let loose that rasping whisper. Shed your shirt. And raise me slow, your mouth demolishing the rest of who I am until I gasp defeat against the firelight in your neck. I just can't see the sense in your bedevilment. What keeps you so possessed by wider gazes, dreaming you're the fool of those who'd ravish without wonder? Come home to the skin you know. Come staunch this mayhem with the medicine inside your sacred hole. Give me what you suppose that white man craves. Oh, Anna, drop me to my knees and call the shaming love. By now, I must have riled you past vexation into wanting. If not, I'll crouch here in blue, content to be your wreckage. Please.
I have a question for Patricia, actually.
Please.
Because you don't just imagine the people in the photographs, but you often imagine the people they love and their entire histories. And I'm just wondering, how much of their imagined life story did you have to sketch out in advance of these poems? How much did you know before they became distilled into the poems?
Yeah, I think I speak a lot about sometimes the best way to tell the story is on the edges of the story. So somebody gets robbed on the way home. Well, who's waiting at home? What's in the bag? Who's waiting at home for them? What's the robber need? It's like you try on all the shoes in the story, and then when the shoes get a little tight, you think, oh, maybe I should start writing now. In terms of this, when I first got the images, when I first look, I might look and say, oh, he's in love. And then later on, maybe something else will come to me, but I remember what drew me to the image in the first place. I also use the photos as prompts the first or second year I taught at Cave Canem. And it's like you give everyone an image and say, every poem you write this week is going to tell me who this person is. And in some of those cases, it kind of upended what I thought. And I said, oh, that story is much better, And so all that, they would come to me one way or the other. It's like, well, yeah, this is who I think you are, but this is who Roger Reeves thinks you are. Or this is, and so whatever, and this is going to sound kind of weird, but eventually you kind of let the person tell you. who they are. There's a real feel. You may be writing one thing and just run into a wall, and say, that's it. This isn't you, is it? And then you put that aside and say, okay, let's sit together for a while, and you tell me, So
It's funny though, because when in both of your books, as I was reading, a line from Robert Hass kept echoing in my mind, that images are like being alive twice. And this is a line that to me feels both profound and prophetic on its own, but then endlessly confusing in kind of an interesting way. And in your book, Patricia, I found that there was often in the poem, it needed to contend with the public facing photograph, the way that a person would present themselves or be able to present themselves, or how they were posed in these sometimes sort of stiff photographs. But then there's an effort for the poem to look through the photograph. So not only to see the image, but then to see through the image and to look into it. So what you're saying about, like, the stories at the edges, what's presented and then what's shielded or protected or not given up, really makes sense. And in the case of your book, Eugenia, of course, you have a reference to Robert Hass in one of your poems. But in your case, I wondered actually about the process of reliving some of the images and turning them over now as a kind of sculptor does, rather than, receiving them in a less controlled way. Maybe we can turn it over to you to read a poem, and then we can ask you about the poem you've read if you're up for that.
Sure. The one that came to mind to read, unfortunately, it's not one of the ones you mentioned to me earlier, Allison. But as Patricia was talking about her mother, your mother, and I was talking about my father, I was thinking of this poem on page 87. And it's called "1 year after my dying father and I stopped speaking to each other again. Someone on the internet is mourning her dad. That old goat, with a gold mine of anecdotes. Scraps of fondness I scrape off her tweet, his beef Wellington, her frogs. I want my frown-scored mouth loaded with her clean vocabulary of love. The way she holds her father's hand, no pinch of humiliation. Like the time I saw a teenager sitting on her father's lap, how I couldn't take my eyes off the alarming purity of it, how my mouth dried at the sight like I had been drinking the wrong water all this time. When I pull the ochreous leaves from my thirsty pothos, it is too easy, no satisfactory rip, too ready to let go. I covet the reels of the lucky ones going on about their dead. Everyone I have lost before the end.
Thank you so much. So what made you turn to that poem in particular? What draws you to that poem?
I think it's hard to talk about estrangement from parents, especially as they age. I think, like Patricia was saying, especially in a lot of communities of color, like in the Korean community, it's unheard of. Your parents could do all kinds of unthinkable things to you, but you don't abandon them. You don't cut ties with them. You don't stop talking to them. And I think it's one of the experiences that makes you feel so alone, especially as you age, especially as your parents age. And this is one of those poems where, even my husband read it and was like, oh, that's a nice poem, but he didn't quite understand it. We're very close to his parents, but I would have friends who I know had experienced estrangement who would just be like, ugh, you got that feeling of being jealous of somebody else's grief. That's something. So it's such a particular experience that is so hard to articulate. And it started out literally as a tweet. Like I'd literally seen somebody, people grieve outwardly, right? We practice a lot of public grief lately, especially on social media, especially when someone close to us died. And, and then when you see that, it's not just that, but you see the thread of everybody else's grief, of the ways that everybody else is remembering their own fathers or their own mothers. And it's beautiful. And I love it. But I also oftentimes find myself feeling covetous of it. And this was, I think, maybe the last poem that I'd written for the book. And think I was feeling a little bit also insecure about the fact that I didn't sort of close the narrative on my father, that I had kind of brought him to the surface because he had reappeared in my life after 7 years of not speaking to each other. And it felt authentic to this narrative of my complex PTSD coming out, especially as he reemerged in my life. But then when he disappeared again, I didn't know how to write that into the book. It felt false to then present my father as, you know, somebody I was grieving or somebody who had died, because that wasn't true to my lived experience. And so I think this poem in a way gave me access to that experience. And I think, you know, when I hear about, you know, somebody who hasn't spoken to her mom in 10 years and then now is contending with the end of her life, I think I weirdly find, I don't know if comfort's the right word, but I just feel like recognition. You know, I feel gratitude that you're able to share that and that somebody like I admire. And it does make me feel less alone. And sorry, I'm gonna tear up. But yeah.
It seems like the tracks that exist for certain narratives of grief and loss, also with parenting and child loss and some of the other things that are explored in your books too, Eugenia, that they are sometimes tracks that need to be moved. There need to be, you know, that there are only a few trains that can fit those tracks. And so what does everyone else do who doesn't fit their train on that track?
Yeah, you spend a lot of time saying, what's wrong with me?
Mm-hmm.
Why can't I fall into line? Why can't I, just turn around and say to myself, this is my mother. It doesn't matter. Love her unconditionally, and really feeling guilt at not being able to do that. And I don't think, if I was not a poet and not in a position to explore that in any way, I think it would have been really, it would have changed the person that I am. I mean, I would have carried that guilt like a boulder for the rest of my life, and maybe pretended and acted my way through love. And who does that? Who really wants to do that? So in one way, I kind of resent the poetry for just kind of being there and chipping away at it. The other way, I never would have come to what I think is kind of a healthy way of looking at it, and don't feel ashamed anymore about saying, but yeah, Mother's Day, all those things, I'm just numb sometimes. I'm so glad that we're together on this show. I am, because I don't think those things are talked about enough.
There's so much more I want to ask you both. I want to give some space to the other people who are watching, who have been lovingly sending in comments and thanks. And I thought we would start with a question that's asked specifically to Patricia, if you don't mind. And this comes from, it just says Mandana, but I think it's Mandana Shafa, who wrote a beautiful, or who, held a beautiful interview with you about Unshuttered. And she speaks of a question she says she wished she had asked you. So I'm going to pose this to you first, Patricia, if you don't mind.
Tell her it's too late.
Oh no, never too late. Poetry community is so small. Mandana says, Patricia, I wish I had asked you this in our talk. Understanding the power of these photos and the pain of not having your own in the suitcase. How much do you document your own life for generations to come? So is this something that you've now self-corrected in some way?
You know what? My life, in so many ways, my family life feels very kind of stilted. Like I said, I'm an only child, and part of what my mother did was kind of cut me off from family that she had. She would tell them she couldn't find me if she didn't know where I was living, or so I did. I've been trying. Are you still there?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Oh.
Yep. Can you hear us? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can hear you, but for some reason, okay, hold on a second.
We can see you and hear you,
Oh,
I
you
think.
can see me. I can't. My desktop is now
Oh,
on
no.
the screen. So wait, is this it? Let's see. No. Okay, well, if you can see me and hear me,
We can see you and hear you.
okay, I won't panic. All right.
You've referred to the figures in Unshuttered as ghosts, and maybe they're
Yes.
playing with us right now.
Oh, okay, yeah, maybe. Yeah, so I took it upon myself to kind of find, my relatives. When a cousin I was really close to died, I got there and realized that my mother was telling me they didn't want to see me. They told me that my mother was telling them that she didn't know where I was. You know, so I'm doing that part. I'm doing that much. I'm trying to recover that. But really quickly, one thing happened to me just yesterday. I was coming home from a reading in Baltimore. I found out that there was also another event in town. It was the Women of the World Poetry Slam. And all these women, and that used to be that I knew the women who were competing. I don't know them anymore. I thought about staying. I decided not to. I'm on the elevator. This young girl says, "Are you Patricia?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Wow." She had a tote bag. She said, "I have your book." And it wasn't the new book. It was Jimmy Savannah. She said, I keep the words close to me because, I keep books that inspire me. I change them every once in a while. She had the book on the elevator where I met her, and she pulled it out. I signed it, and I thought about that later, that this is someone 2 generations younger than I am, really rooted in the poetry. And my word, something I said still reached her enough for her to carry it around. And I thought, that's my family too. you
Mhm.
know that's my family. And I think about that. I'm surrounded. The people who are closest to me in my life are poets, and poets that have not just, it's a recreational exercise, but poets who are realizing that we write also to move sanely from day to day, you and people that I've known for 30, 40 years. So I think I've kind of crafted my own family along the way, and I
Mm.
can see generations to come. That family, we have that central thing that's going to bind all of us. And so I feel that that's as much the idea of family as the traditional one.
Oh my goodness. Well, I think being out in the world and both of you doing so many public appearances and so many readings, I feel like that's another way to exchange intimacies and not document in the kind of ossified way, but another way in which to give of yourself and fill other people's suitcases, even with memories, live, breathing memories. I wanted to ask Eugenia, you something related. When reading some of your poems, I myself just personally appreciated the way they were often about sustained tension. Rather than featuring sustained tension, they often rejected the idea, I felt, of the impulse toward a narrative arc where everything had to be resolved. And I really identified with a lot of the sustained tension as the answer, as the final point. How do you carry this? How do you carry sustained tension when there isn't a reaching for a resolution or the possibility of a revolution of a resolution rather? So I kept thinking of that, that canonical poem, My Papa's Waltz by Theodore Roethke, and how there is the young boy who is the participant in this complicated relationship with family members. And then there's the older poet who is writing about it. And so I wondered if you could talk for a second, both of you in some ways engage in persona poems. I wondered if, Eugenia, you could lead us maybe in talking a little bit about how writing about experiences brings new perspective potentially. I don't know that it's necessarily positive, but brings new perspective to the experience of living certain things, if that question resonates with you.
It does. I think I've talk a lot about dialectical thinking, which is a term I learned through therapy, which is the idea that the brain is capable of holding two opposite truths at the same time. And I think my brain is constantly doing that, right? I appreciate my mother. I appreciate the sacrifices she made, but I'm also angry with the ways that her choices kept us in danger and kept us in an environment of abuse. And I think now as a mother, I'm the most furious I've ever been, but also the most hopeful I've ever been. And I don't have easy answers in general in my life. And I think I also feel a little bit allergic to easy answers, having grown up in a very conservative Christian home
Mhm.
and having been having had my trauma or my pain dismissed because, you know, I should be a new creation. I should be looking for redemption in my life, not focused on what is dead or what is past. But living with PTSD and recognizing that actually that's not possible for some of us. For some of us, the past is constantly rising up within the body and within our mind. And so I think it was important for me, even if I did invite a voice that was more hopeful or a perspective that was more hopeful, it was important to me to hold on still to the anger and hold on to the pain so that the hopefulness will complicate and will deepen the pain, but never erase it. It was important to me that both could exist simultaneously.
What do you think about that, Patricia? Does it resonate with you at all, especially in terms of persona work?
Persona work it's tricky in a lot of ways. The first time that I saw it, you know, it was kind of live and it was kind of hit me in the face. There's a woman was doing a persona poem in the voice of the person who cut the hair of people who were about to go in the gas chamber. And the people didn't know that that's the barber knew, but they didn't know. And so the possibilities and potential of persona, but it gives me a way. You know, I've got a poem about a skinhead, and there are a lot of complex feelings there, and there's a lot of anger. But what it gave me a chance to do was say, we both started here, and for some reason he went this way and I went this way. So instead of glaring at each other from these positions, let's see if I can figure out what, you know, bring us back to center and maybe restart our lives a little bit and see what could have happened to change that. So it's a little bit of oh God, such a huge conversation. It's a little bit of God play, you know, but it also is a way of entering stories which may actually be about you. I mean, it's another one of those entry points that allows you to recenter the the heavy emotional weight, at least for a while. You know, I tell students sometimes write in persona first if you want, and then pull it back and just put the personal pronouns in and see how you feel. But it allows that distance, and allows you to put more fever into the story. But I'm not under any delusion that most of the time when I'm exploring persona, I'm exploring myself.
You've said elsewhere that slam taught you both the advantages and downfalls, rather, of persona. And I just want to give a quick shout out to two books. You mentioned that this is such a big conversation. First of all, Joshua Bennett's book that either just came out or is about to come out about the history of slam and spoken word poetry as being something that is probably going to take up this question and is sure to be an excellent book. And then also Richard Hugo's Triggering Town, which talks a little bit too about how, you know, and Kevin Young's The Gray Album, which talks about, you know, how fiction can be the safe harbor for truth when, as another writer says, when truth can't be contained by fact. So I think there's so many different ways to spin off in this, and I want to thank you both. There's two more comment questions that I want to showcase, and then I thought I would end with a sort of final thanks to you both. First of all, we have what is a question, but I think it's going to be a hard question to answer, so I'm going to frame it as a comment. Ellen Commissar says, a question for Patricia. When you were at the Chicago Sun-Times with me, Ellen Lesser, did you ever imagine that this is who you would become? So it sounds to me like praise and excitement.
Ellen Lesser, a blast from the past. No. When I was at the Sun-Times, I really had no idea what I was going to say what I was doing. Really, I just know I wanted to write. I knew that I didn't know much about creative writing. And also I had my mother especially telling me that creative writing was not a career choice. When I first said I wanted to be a writer, she said only white men do that, and to this day, she doesn't see it as an option. She could right now, she would tell me, hey, they're hiring at the post office. It's just not a thing. So no, and then I thought, okay, what other ways are there to write? It's like, oh, okay, there's newspapers or there's magazines, there's things. So, and I floundered and said, and it wasn't, it was okay. It was fun. It was at that time, it was fun because it was kind of the heyday of Chicago journalism, and it was Mike Royko and all this cool stuff, and people knocking people off of bar stools, and it was great, but it wasn't the type of writing I should have been doing.
Mm.
And I think it just needed to, in some way, that landscape needed to be burned flat. So I didn't stay there that long. And then I think things guide you toward, and guide you several times. Say, this is where and you fight it and you go, that's not a real job. This is where you're, until your options are gone, but no, Ellen. Hi, Ellen. But no, I did not, could not have imagined this in my wildest dreams. I'm at a very, very, very good place in my writing, and a good place in my life. And I'm very happy about that.
Eugenia, would you have expected the warm reception that you've received? I think it seems warm and very enthusiastic. Everywhere I go, people are praising Bianca. How does it make you feel?
Surprised, but also I was I think, there was a 3-year period during the 9 years between my first and second books where I wasn't writing, I wasn't reading. I'd cut myself off from my writing community. I hadn't published poems in 3 years, and I was scared. I thought I'd have to start from square one, or that if I were ever to write another book, no one would care. And I felt a little bit desperate. Like, I knew I'd poured so much into this book in a way that was very different from the first book, and I wanted people to read it. Even if I read it or wrote it as if I wanted nobody to read it, I think now that it's a book, I do want that. And I've been, very pleasantly surprised, but also really grateful. I think it came at a time when, we're ready to talk about mental illness. We're ready to talk about motherhood in a way that isn't saccharine, but is more real. And I think I've found that I've made a lot of friends, I guess, in a way who just resonate with some of these experiences, and I'm grateful. I mean, it's still new. It's still been out for less than a month, and so I'm still kind of getting used to it. And yeah.
It's clear both books are going to have a long life. I want to end with 2 more comments. One from our friend Mandana, who says that she really appreciates what you both are saying about the hidden or less visible in your lives and how that shows up in your work, how to use language to describe slantly what is inexpressible. And I would really agree with that. And the books offer such a great manual for how to approach that. I also just wanted to end, if you wouldn't mind, on a personal note about an interesting intersection that I felt when reading both books together, which is both how hard it is and how frustrating it is for the imagination to be limited in some way, as in, the limitations on your access, Patricia, to your own family history, photographs, and so on and so forth. And also in your case, Eugenia, the way the imagination sometimes can be hijacked with inherited fear and things like that. But also in both books, I felt like there was not, as you say, a saccharine respite, but some sort of sense of the irrepressibility of the imagination, and hopefully of poetry's imagination, which is already complex and already, sort of, sustaining in terms of the way it contends with challenging things, how much it can provide a path for reflection and maybe even healing. So I wanted to thank you both deeply personally and on behalf of everyone who's watched tonight. Anything final you would like to say to our guests or to each other?
Just want to say,
Eugenia and I would like to be booked together from now on.
Oh my God, I would die. Please.
We're going to start our tour tonight. So if anybody out there does any booking, the books came out at almost exactly the same time.
Okay, I'm sorry, but I'm going to hold you to that.
How they work together.
They do.
Yeah. Yeah. So we're bar
I-
mitzvahs, birthday parties. We're there.
Oh, I'm happy to do a bar mitzvah with Patricia only, though.
I have to say too, the notes. I've been looking at the notes. A Mighty Blaze is on point with. I've never seen such amazing notes and backdrops. And then, before I'm thinking something, I look over and I said, "Oh, there it is already." Okay, that's one. But Allison, you've been absolutely wonderful. This
Well,
has
I
been.
want to give a shout out to
Yeah, thank you, Allison.
Kimberly, who is
Oh,
helping us.
Kimberly, that's right, Kimberly. It's like you're not there, but you're everywhere. That's fantastic.
Well,
Yeah,
thank you both. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Eugenia.
Yeah, just thank you, Allison, Kimberly, and thank you so much, Patricia. It's, I'm a huge fan, and I was a little anxious about this, but you're the kindest
No reason.
person, also on top of being a fabulous poet,
Oh,
and I'm
this
just
is
so
sweet.
grateful to do this with you. So thank you.
You and me, Kit.
I would love it.
This is like poetic matchmaking. I'm feeling so good. What is the best way to begin National Poetry Month and to remind ourselves that poetry is a community and that connecting with each other and supporting each other's work and celebrating each other's work is what it's about, nothing else. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you to Miss Patricia Smith and Miss Eugenia Leigh. I appreciate you both so much and your work personally and on behalf of everyone who's here. Thanks for the shout out to A Mighty Blaze. For anyone who's interested in learning more, you can go to our website. We have programs for nonfiction, literary fiction, memoir, a cooking show. There's everything to celebrate books and their authors. So thank you to those of you who are interested. And I wish everyone a good National Poetry Month. And I look forward to seeing you again next month. So thank you again to Eugenia and Patricia.